the most shocking auction in Colorado history, when two sisters were sold like livestock. One mountain man's words changed everything forever. In the scorching summer of 1887, on the dusty main street of Copper Ridge, Colorado, something so shocking occurred that witnesses would speak of it in hushed whispers for decades to come. Two innocent sisters, ridiculed and humiliated, were literally put up for auction by their own flesh and blood, sold like cattle to the highest bidder. But when a mysterious, battle-scarred mountain man stepped forward with words that would echo through eternity, everything changed. This is their story of dignity, rising from the ashes of shame, of family, forged not by blood but by choice, and of how sometimes the darkest moments give birth to the most extraordinary miracles. Stay with me until the very end of this incredible journey, and please let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories of hope and redemption travel around the world. The sun beat down mercilessly on the main street of Copper Ridge, Colorado. That fateful day in July of 1887, its rays turning the dusty thoroughfare into a shimmering furnace that seemed to mock the very notion of human decency. The wooden boardwalks creaked under the weight of gathering townspeople, their faces etched with a mixture of morbid curiosity and cruel anticipation that would have made angels weep. For this was no ordinary day in the small mining town nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. This was the day that would forever stain the conscience of every soul who witnessed what was about to unfold. At the center of it all stood a makeshift platform hastily constructed from weathered planks and rusty nails, its surface already scarred by the boots of livestock that had been paraded across it in previous auctions. The irony was not lost on the more thoughtful observers, though such individuals were precious few among the crowd that had gathered like vultures circling carrion. This platform, which had seen the sale of horses, cattle, and farm equipment, was about to witness something far more sinister, something that would challenge every notion of human dignity and Christian charity that the good people of Copper Ridge claimed to hold dear. The auctioneer, a rail-thin man named Jeremiah Wickham, with a voice that could cut through steel, and a conscience apparently made of the same material, stood atop a wooden crate, his gavel already worn smooth from years of hammering down prices on everything from prize bulls to patent medicines. His eyes, small and dark like raisins pressed into dough, surveyed the crowd with the calculating gaze of a man who saw dollar signs where others might see souls. Today's auction, he had announced with characteristic bluntness, would include miscellaneous household goods, farming implements, and other items of interest to discerning buyers. The other items were what had drawn this particular crowd, for word had spread through the town like wildfire in dry grass. Old Henrik Haskins, the town drunk, whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his talent for finding the bottom of every whiskey bottle in 3 counties, had finally decided to rid himself of what he considered his greatest burdens. His 2 daughters, Clara and Bess, were to be sold to whoever would take them off his hands, and more importantly, out of his miserable life. Henrik himself stood near the platform, swaying slightly, on legs that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. His beard, once perhaps a respectable brown, had long since turned the color of tobacco juice and disappointment. His clothes hung on his skeletal frame like rags on a scarecrow, and the smell of cheap whiskey and cheaper regret clung to him like a shroud. In his bloodshot eyes burned a mixture of desperation and defiance, the look of a man who had long since abandoned any pretense of decency but still possessed just enough awareness to know the depths to which he had fallen. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wickham's voice cracked like a whip across the assembled crowd, "we have here today a most unusual opportunity for those among you seeking domestic arrangements." The euphemism hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and several women in the crowd had the grace to look away, though their husbands leaned forward with interest that spoke poorly of their character. It was then that the sisters were brought forward, and the sight of them would have moved stones to tears had stones possessed more compassion than the human hearts gathered in that dusty street. Clara the elder, at 23, moved with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to navigate a world that had never shown her kindness. Her brown hair, though clean and carefully braided, could not disguise the premature lines of worry that creased her forehead, nor could her simple blue dress hide the way her hands trembled as she climbed the wooden steps to the platform. Bess, younger by 2 years but older in suffering, followed her sister with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to find strength in prayer when the world offered none. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight like burnished copper, and her green eyes, though red-rimmed from tears both recent and ancient, still held a spark of defiance that all their father's cruelty had failed to extinguish. She wore a dress of faded yellow that had once belonged to their mother, and in her hands she clutched a small leather Bible, its pages worn smooth by countless readings in the dark hours, when hope seemed as distant as the stars. The crowd's reaction was immediate and predictable. Snickers rippled through the assembled townspeople like wind through wheat, and comments that would have shamed the devil himself were muttered just loud enough to be heard by their intended targets. The sisters stood together on the platform, their heads held high despite the crimson flush of humiliation that stained their cheeks, their hands clasped together in a grip that spoke of shared strength in the face of unimaginable degradation. "Now then," Wickham continued, his voice taking on the sing-song cadence of a man well-versed in the art of human commerce. "What we have here are 2 fine specimens of womanhood, well-trained in the domestic arts and available for immediate employment." The pause before that last word was filled with implications that made several of the more decent citizens in the crowd shift uncomfortably on their feet. "They can cook clean and tend to household duties," Henrik called out from beside the platform, his words slurred but clear enough to carry his meaning. "Clara there makes the finest bread west of Denver, and Bess can sing hymns pretty as an angel. Both of 'em are strong as oxen and twice as useful." The comparison to livestock was deliberate, and the sisters' faces burned with fresh shame at their father's words. "What's the starting bid?" called out a voice from the crowd. It belonged to Samuel Graves, the owner of the largest saloon in town, and a man whose reputation with women was as unsavory as the whiskey he served. His small, piggish eyes gleamed with an interest that made Clara step closer to her sister, as if proximity might somehow shield them both from the hungry gazes that swept over them like flames. "Let's start the bidding at $50 for the pair," Wickham announced, raising his gavel with theatrical flourish. "Do I hear 50? 50. Graves called out immediately, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a knife through silk. Several other hands went up around the square, and the sisters watched in growing horror as their worth was calculated in dollars and cents like so much livestock at market. 60 from Miller, 70 from Graves, 80 from Thompson. Wickham's voice rose with each bid, and with it rose the sisters' terror. Each number called out was another nail in the coffin of their dignity, another step toward a fate that neither dared to contemplate too closely. Clara's grip on her sister's hand tightened until their knuckles showed white beneath the skin. "Whatever happens," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing chaos of the auction, "we stay together. Promise me, Bess. Whatever happens, we don't let them separate us." Bess nodded, unable to trust her voice, her free hand clutching the Bible until the leather creaked in protest. Around them the bidding continued to climb, and with each increase came fresh waves of commentary from the crowd that would have made sailors blush. Some of the remarks were directed at their appearance, cruel jibes about their size and their circumstances that cut deeper than any physical blow ever could. Others were speculations about their future services that made Clara feel sick to her stomach and sent Bess's lips moving in silent prayer. 125, Thompson shouted, his face red with excitement and something else that neither sister cared to identify. He was a rancher from outside town, a widower known for his harsh treatment of hired hands and his even harsher treatment of anything in skirts. The thought of being under his power sent shivers of terror through both young women. 130 from Graves. The saloon owner's bid carried with it implications that needed no explanation. Everyone in Copper Ridge knew what became of women who found themselves in Samuel Graves's employ, and the knowledge sat in the sisters' stomachs like lead weights. Sheriff Morton Williams stood at the edge of the crowd, his badge catching the sunlight in brief, mocking flashes. He should have put a stop to this travesty, should have recognized that what was happening here violated every law of God and man, but instead he stood with his arms crossed and his face carefully neutral, as if the sale of human beings was as commonplace as the morning mail delivery. His inaction spoke volumes about the moral bankruptcy that had infected not just individuals but the very institutions meant to protect the innocent. 150. Came another voice, this one belonging to Marcus Chen, who ran the general store and had been widowed the previous winter. He was a quieter man than some of the others, but the desperate hunger in his eyes as he looked at the sisters suggested that loneliness had driven him to depths he might never have imagined possible in his younger, more innocent days. As the bidding climbed past the $200 mark, a murmur of excitement swept through the crowd. This was more entertainment than Copper Ridge had seen since the last public hanging, and the townspeople were clearly enjoying the spectacle with the enthusiasm that spoke poorly of their collective character. Children who should have been sent away stood wide-eyed among the adults, absorbing lessons about human nature that no child should ever have to learn. The sisters found themselves the center of a maelstrom of greed, lust, and casual cruelty that seemed to strip away every pretense of civilization from the assembled crowd. Men who sat in church pews every Sunday morning and sang hymns with apparent sincerity now called out bids on human flesh with the same casual air they might use to purchase a new plow or a breeding sow. Women who claimed to follow the teachings of Christ stood by in silence, their faces revealing mixtures of disgust, pity, and in some cases a vindictive satisfaction at seeing others brought lower than themselves. 225. The bid came from a new voice, deeper and rougher than the others, and it carried with it an authority that momentarily silenced the crowd. All eyes turned toward the source of the voice, and what they saw made more than a few people take an involuntary step backward. Standing at the very edge of the crowd was a man who seemed to have stepped out of legend itself. He was tall, easily 6.5 feet, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world, and arms that looked as if they had been carved from the very mountains that surrounded their town. His hair black as a raven's wing with threads of silver woven through it, like precious metal through dark ore hung to his shoulders, in a style that spoke of time spent far from the niceties of civilization. His face was weathered by sun and wind and marked by scars that told stories of battles fought and survived, while his eyes, blue as the deepest mountain lakes, held depths that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. He wore the simple clothes of a mountain man, buckskin jacket over a wool shirt, heavy pants that had seen hard use, and boots that looked as if they had walked every trail from Mexico to Canada. At his side hung a knife with a handle worn smooth by countless hands, and across his back was slung a rifle that looked as if it had been his companion through more adventures than most men could survive. But it was not his weapons or his size that commanded attention. It was something indefinable in his bearing, a quiet strength that suggested he was a man who had looked death in the eye more than once and had never been the first to blink. 225, he repeated, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet square, and not a penny more for what you're trying to do here. Wickham's face flushed red at the implied criticism. Sir, this is a legitimate auction conducted according to the laws of Colorado Territory. If you wish to bid, you're welcome to do so, but I'll thank you not to comment on the proceedings. The mountain man stepped forward and the crowd parted before him like the Red Sea before Moses. Each step he took seemed to echo with the weight of divine judgment, and more than one person in that crowd felt the uncomfortable stirring of a conscience they had thought long dead. When he reached the platform, he looked up at the sisters with eyes that held not hunger or calculation, but something that neither Clara nor Bess had seen in so long they had almost forgotten it existed: simple human compassion. "You girls have names," he asked, his voice gentle despite its power, addressing them directly rather than treating them as objects to be discussed by others. Clara found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I'm Clara Haskins, and this is my sister Bess." He nodded as if their names were precious things deserving of respect. "I'm Ezekiel Boone, and I want you both to know that whatever happens here today, you're not cattle to be sold to the highest bidder. You're daughters of Eve, created in God's image, and anybody who can't see that is blind to the most important truths this world has to offer." His words hit the crowd like physical blows, and more than a few faces showed the sting of well-deserved shame. But the auction was not finished, and other bidders were not yet ready to concede defeat. 300, Graves called out, his voice sharp with irritation at the interruption. "And I'll thank the mountain man to keep his philosophy to himself." 350, Ezekiel replied calmly, never taking his eyes off the sisters. The bidding continued, but something had changed in the atmosphere of the auction. What had begun as a carnival of cruelty was slowly transforming into something else entirely. A test of wills between those who saw the sisters as objects and the one man who recognized their humanity. With each bid Ezekiel made, he seemed to be making a statement not just about his financial resources, but about the very nature of human dignity. 400, Thompson shouted, sweat now beading on his forehead despite the mountain air. 450, Ezekiel responded, his voice as steady as bedrock. 500, this from Graves, whose face had gone red with frustration and something that looked very much like fear. He had come here expecting easy prey, and instead found himself facing a force of nature that refused to be intimidated. The crowd had grown quiet now, sensing that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple auction. Children pressed closer to their parents, instinctively understanding that momentous events were unfolding before their eyes. Even Sheriff Williams had straightened up, his hand resting unconsciously on his gun belt, as if preparing for trouble that hadn't yet materialized, but hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Clara and Bess stood frozen on the platform, hardly daring to breathe, as their fate was decided by voices calling out numbers that represented more money than they had ever seen in their lives. The mountain man's words echoed in their minds, daughters of Eve, created in God's image. And for the first time in years, they felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. $600, Ezekiel said, and this time his voice carried a note of finality that seemed to settle over the crowd like a heavy blanket. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. 600 in gold, right here, right now. The sight of actual gold had a galvanizing effect on the crowd. Paper money was one thing, promises another, but gold was real, substantial, immediate. Wickham's eyes widened at the sight of it, and Henrik Haskins literally licked his lips as if he could taste the whiskey that money would buy. "Do I hear 7? Wickham called out, but his voice lacked its earlier enthusiasm. $600 was more than most men in Copper Ridge saw in 2 years, and the sight of it sitting there in real, tangible form had sobered the crowd considerably. Graves opened his mouth as if to bid again, then looked at the mountain man's face and seemed to think better of it. There was something in those blue eyes that suggested crossing this particular individual might result in consequences that extended far beyond the loss of an auction. Thompson, too, fell silent, his earlier enthusiasm apparently cooled by the reality of the sums being discussed. 700 high, came a new voice from the back of the crowd. It belonged to Cyrus Blackwood, a man whose wealth came from sources that decent people preferred not to examine too closely. He dealt in what he called specialty goods, and what others whispered were services that existed in the shadows of civilized society. His presence at the auction had surprised no one, but his willingness to bid against the mountain man showed either tremendous courage or tremendous stupidity. Ezekiel turned slowly to face the new bidder, and the movement had the deliberate quality of a predator acknowledging a challenge. When he spoke, his voice carried across the crowd with the clarity of a church bell. "Mr. Blackwood, isn't it? I know your reputation, and I know what you'd want these girls for. 750 and fair warning, there won't be another bid from you." The threat was delivered with such quiet certainty that it sent chills down the spines of everyone present. This was not the bluster of a man trying to intimidate through volume and aggression, but the simple statement of fact from someone who had clearly seen enough violence to know exactly how much he was capable of delivering. Blackwood's face went pale and his hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip, before freezing as he apparently realized the futility of the gesture. Whatever he saw in the mountain man's eyes convinced him that discretion was indeed the better part of valor. I withdraw my bid," he stammered, and the humiliation in his voice was palpable. $750, Wickham announced, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do I hear 8? The silence that followed was profound and complete. Even the horses tied to the hitching posts seemed to sense the tension and stood motionless, their ears pricked forward as if listening for sounds that human ears could not detect. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, its bronze voice a reminder of divine presence in a place where divine principles had been notably absent. "Going once," Wickham called out, but there was no enthusiasm in his voice now. The auction had taken a turn that none of them had anticipated, and the auctioneer looked as if he wanted nothing more than to bring the whole sordid affair to a rapid conclusion. "Going twice." Clara felt her sister's hand squeeze hers so tightly that her fingers went numb, but she barely noticed. Her entire attention was focused on the mountain man who stood below them like some avenging angel sent from heaven to right the wrongs of a fallen world. She had prayed for deliverance, but she had never imagined it would come in such an unexpected form. Sold. Wickham's gavel came down with a sound like thunder, and with that single word the lives of Clara and Bess Haskins changed forever. "To the gentleman for $750. Ezekiel climbed the steps to the platform with movements that seemed almost ritualistic in their solemnity. When he reached the sisters, he pulled the leather pouch from his jacket and counted out the gold coins one by one into Wickham's greedy palm. Each coin caught the sunlight as it fell glinting like stars in the gathering dusk of the sisters' old life. "There's your blood money," Ezekiel said to Henrik, his voice carrying a weight of judgment that made the older man flinch. $750 for 2 human souls. I hope it buys you enough whiskey to drown whatever's left of your conscience." Henrik reached for the money with hands that shook like autumn leaves, but Ezekiel caught his wrist before he could touch the coins. "But understand this, old man," the mountain man continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout ever could. "If I ever see you within a mile of these girls again, if I ever hear that you've so much as spoken their names in anything but the most respectful terms, you'll answer to me. And that's not a threat. It's a promise written in stone and signed in blood." He released Henrik's wrist, and the older man stumbled backward as if he had been struck. The money fell to the platform with a musical clatter that seemed almost obscene in the heavy silence that had fallen over the crowd. Ezekiel turned to the sisters, and when he spoke to them, his voice was transformed, becoming gentle as a spring breeze after the storm of his anger. "Ladies, I know this has been a terrible ordeal for you, and I'm sorry you had to endure it, but I want you to know that you're safe now. I'm taking you to my cabin in the mountains where you'll have a roof over your heads and food in your bellies, and nobody will ever treat you as anything less than the precious daughters of God that you are. Clara found her voice at last, though it came out cracked and broken by emotion. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for us? You don't even know us." Ezekiel's scarred face softened into something that might have been a smile, though it was touched by a sadness so profound that it seemed to echo through the very foundations of the earth. "Because everybody deserves a chance at dignity, miss. Because nobody should have to face this world alone. And because sometimes when you've seen enough darkness, you learn to recognize light when it appears, no matter what form it takes." He offered his arms to help them down from the platform, and after a moment's hesitation, both sisters accepted his assistance. As their feet touched the solid ground of the street, Clara felt as if she were taking her first real steps into a new life, leaving behind not just the platform, but everything that platform represented. The crowd began to disperse, many of them unable to meet the eyes of the sisters or the mountain man who had claimed them. There would be talk, of course. There was always talk in a town like Copper Ridge. But for the first time in their lives, Clara and Bess found themselves protected by someone who possessed both the will and the ability to silence those who would do them harm. As they walked toward the edge of town where Ezekiel's horse and wagon waited, Bess finally found her voice. "Mr. Boone," she said, her words barely audible above the sound of their footsteps on the wooden boardwalk. "I don't know how we'll ever repay you for what you've done." Ezekiel paused in his walking and turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw depths of understanding that spoke of a man who had himself known loss and redemption in equal measure. "Miss Bess," he said gently, "where I come from, family takes care of family, and as of today, you and your sister are my family. There's no debt between family, just love and loyalty and the promise to stand by each other when the world gets hard." As they climbed into the wagon that would carry them away from Copper Ridge and toward whatever future awaited them, in the mountains neither Clara nor Bess could have imagined the trials and triumphs that lay ahead. They could not have foreseen the challenges that would test their newfound family, nor the enemies who would rise to threaten their fragile happiness. But for the first time in their lives, they faced the unknown with hope instead of fear, knowing that they were no longer alone in their struggle against a world that too often forgot the value of human kindness. The wagon wheels began to turn, carrying them away from the scene of their humiliation and toward a destiny that none of them could have anticipated. Behind them, the town of Copper Ridge settled back into its daily routine, but the echoes of what had transpired in that dusty street would resonate through the lives of everyone present for years to come. Some would be haunted by their participation in the degradation of innocence, while others would carry with them the memory of one man's stand against injustice, as a reminder that heroism often appears in the most unexpected forms. And in the mountains ahead, a new chapter was about to begin in the lives of three souls who had found each other not through blood or marriage, but through the simple recognition that in a world full of darkness, even the smallest light was worth protecting with everything they had. The wagon wheels carved deep furrows in the mountain trail as they climbed higher into the Colorado wilderness, each turn of the path taking them further from the nightmare of Copper Ridge and deeper into a landscape that seemed untouched by human cruelty. The afternoon sun slanted through towering pines, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn planks of the wagon bed, where Clara and Bess huddled together, still hardly daring to believe that their ordeal was truly over. Ezekiel guided the horses with practiced ease, his weathered hands gentle on the reins as he navigated the treacherous switchbacks that wound up the mountainside like a serpent's spine. The silence between them was not uncomfortable but contemplative, each lost in thoughts too complex for easy words. The only sounds were the steady clip-clop of hooves on stone, the creak of leather harness, and the whisper of wind through the evergreens that stood like silent sentinels along their path. As they climbed, the air grew thinner and cooler, carrying with it the clean scent of pine needles and mountain streams. Clara found herself breathing deeply for the first time in months, as if the very atmosphere of this high country could cleanse her lungs of the dust and degradation of the valley below. Beside her, Bess clutched her Bible with white knuckles, her lips moving in silent prayers of gratitude that rose toward the peaks like incense. "How much further?" Clara finally asked, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the wagon wheels on the rocky trail. Ezekiel turned slightly in his seat, offering them a reassuring smile that transformed his scarred features into something unexpectedly gentle. "Not much now, another hour, maybe less. The cabin's just over that ridge there in a valley where the morning sun hits first and the evening light lingers longest." As if summoned by his words, the trail crested a final rise, and spread before them was a sight that took both sisters' breath away. Nestled in a natural amphitheater carved from the living rock by some ancient glacier was a small valley perhaps half a mile across, carpeted in wild grass that waved like green silk in the mountain breeze. A stream meandered through its center, its waters catching the late afternoon light like scattered diamonds, while on either side the valley walls rose in granite majesty toward peaks that seemed to scrape the very dome of heaven. At the valley's heart sat Ezekiel's cabin, and Clara felt her stomach tighten as she took in their new home. The structure was small, perhaps 20 feet square, built of logs that had been carefully chinked with mud and moss. The roof was made of split shakes that had weathered to silver gray, and from the stone chimney rose a thin tendril of smoke that spoke of warmth waiting within. A small barn stood nearby, its walls leaning at angles that suggested more character than engineering skill, while a wooden corral held 2 horses that lifted their heads to whinny greetings to their approaching companions. But it was the garden that drew Clara's attention most strongly. Someone had carved beds from the rocky soil, creating neat rows where vegetables grew in ordered profusion. She could see the green tops of carrots, the broad leaves of squash, and the climbing vines of beans that had been trained up wooden poles with the patience of someone who understood that good things took time to grow. "It's beautiful," Bess whispered, and Clara heard wonder in her sister's voice, as if she had not expected to find such peace in this world. "It's not much," Ezekiel said, and there was something almost apologetic in his tone. "The roof leaks when the rain comes hard and the winter wind finds every crack in the walls, but it's solid and it's safe and it's got room enough for 3 if we don't mind being cozy." As they drew closer to the cabin, Clara noticed details that spoke of a man who had learned to care for himself in this isolated place. Firewood was stacked neatly under an overhang built specifically for that purpose, protecting it from the mountain weather. Tools hung from pegs driven into the cabin's exterior walls, their handles worn smooth by years of use. A water barrel stood at the corner where the roof runoff could be collected, and nearby was a crude but functional washstand where a man could clean himself after a day's hard work. The horses came to a stop beside the cabin, and Ezekiel swung down from the wagon seat with the easy grace of someone who had spent his life in the saddle. He moved to the back of the wagon and extended his hands to help the sisters down, his touch respectful and careful, as if he understood that trust once broken was a fragile thing that must be rebuilt one gentle gesture at a time. "Welcome home," he said simply, and Clara felt tears spring to her eyes at the word home. When was the last time any place had deserved that name? When was the last time she had felt truly safe anywhere in this hard world? The cabin's interior was Spartanly furnished but meticulously clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clear of ash and ready for the evening fire. A rough-hewn table sat in the center of the single room, surrounded by 3 chairs of mismatched wood that had been crafted with more attention to function than beauty. Against the far wall stood a narrow bed, its frame built from pine logs, and its mattress clearly stuffed with pine needles and mountain grass. "I know it's not what you're used to," Ezekiel began, But Clara interrupted him with a shake of her head. "Mr. Boone," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "this is the finest home we've seen in longer than I care to remember. Our father's place was—" She paused, searching for words that could convey the squalor and despair of their previous existence without dwelling too heavily on darkness they were trying to leave behind. "This is wonderful." Ezekiel nodded, understanding more than she had spoken. "There's a loft up there," he said, pointing to a ladder that led to an opening in the cabin's roof space. "It's not much, but it's private, and I've got extra blankets to make it comfortable. I figured you ladies might want your own space." The thoughtfulness of the gesture struck both sisters with fresh force. This man who barely knew them, who had spent a fortune to rescue them from degradation, was now offering them not just shelter, but privacy, dignity, and respect. Clara felt her throat tighten with gratitude so profound it was almost painful. As the evening settled over the valley like a comfortable blanket, the three of them worked together to prepare their first meal as a family. Clara took charge of the cooking with the natural authority of someone who had been responsible for such things since childhood, while Bess set the table and Ezekiel tended to the horses and secured the cabin for the night. The domestic routine felt strange but wonderful after the chaos and uncertainty of their recent existence. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Boone," Clara said, as she stirred a pot of stew that filled the cabin with rich, comforting aromas. "What brought you to this valley? How did you come to be in Copper Ridge today?" Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire that crackled cheerfully in the stone hearth. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories both treasured and painful. "I came here after the war," he said simply. "I'd seen enough of what men can do to each other, and I needed a place where the only sounds were wind and water and the voices of things that God made directly without human interference." "But which war?" Bess asked gently, settling into her chair with her Bible still clutched in her hands. "The big one, the one that tore our country apart and left scars on every soul that survived it." He paused, his scarred hands turning his coffee cup in slow circles on the wooden table. "I was at Gettysburg, at Antietam, at places whose names are written in blood and tears. I saw boys who should have been thinking about girls and harvest dances die in mud that was more red than brown, and I came to understand that some wounds never heal completely, they just learn to live with the pain." Clara ladled stew into wooden bowls, her movements careful and precise as she absorbed this revelation about the man who had become their savior. "Is that where you got those scars?" she asked softly. Ezekiel's hand moved unconsciously to his face, tracing the white lines that marked his left cheek like lightning frozen in flesh. "Some of them. Others came later from bears and mountain cats and men who thought the wilderness was lawless enough for them to take what they wanted without consequence. But the deepest scars aren't the ones you can see." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the simple food tasting like ambrosia after the uncertainty and terror of the day. Outside, the mountain night settled over their valley with a peace so profound it seemed to seep through the cabin walls and into their very bones. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, its voice echoing off the granite walls with haunting beauty that spoke of wildness and freedom. "I need to ask you both something," Ezekiel said, eventually setting down his spoon and looking at each sister in turn. "What happened today in Copper Ridge, that's over. It's done, and it never touches you again as long as I draw breath. But I need to know what you want to do with the rest of your lives. I'm not your owner, and I'm not your keeper. I'm your friend and hopefully your family, but the choices about your future are yours to make." Clara exchanged a glance with her sister, seeing her own confusion reflected in Bess's green eyes. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean that if you want to stay here in the valley, you're welcome for as long as you like. There's work enough for all of us, and God knows I could use the company and the help. But if you want to go somewhere else, start fresh in a place where nobody knows your story, I'll see that you get there safely and with enough money to make a new beginning." The offer hung in the air between them, generous beyond anything they had dared to hope for. Clara felt tears gathering in her eyes again, but these were different from the tears of shame and terror she had shed earlier. These were tears of gratitude and wonder at finding themselves in the presence of such unexpected kindness. "Mr. Boone," Bess said quietly, "we don't have anywhere else to go." "We don't have anyone else in the world. If you'll have us, we'd like to stay at least for a while. We can work hard, and we won't be any trouble." Trouble. Ezekiel's laugh was warm and genuine. "Ladies, I've been alone in this valley for 8 years, talking to horses and ravens and my own shadow, having real conversation and home-cooked meals, and the sound of human voices that aren't echoing off mountain walls is about as far from trouble as I can imagine." As the night deepened, they began the delicate process of learning to live together, 3 strangers who had become family through circumstance and choice, rather than blood and law. Ezekiel showed them where supplies were kept, how to work the pump that brought water from the well, and which areas of the valley were safe for walking alone. Clara and Bess shared what they could about their skills and their hopes, tentatively beginning to believe that they might actually have a future worth planning. The first test of their new arrangement came just 3 days later, when Clara was working in the garden and heard the sound of approaching horses. Her blood turned to ice in her veins as she recognized the possibility that their father might have come looking for them, or worse, that some of the men from the auction might have decided to pay a visit. She dropped her weeding tools and ran toward the cabin, calling for Ezekiel with a voice that cracked with fear. He emerged from the barn at a run, a rifle in his hands, and his face set in lines of grim determination. "Get inside," he told both sisters, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Bar the door, and don't open it for anyone but me." But as the riders crested the ridge and came into clear view, Ezekiel relaxed slightly. There were 3 of them, and Clara could see even from a distance that they wore the clothes of working men rather than the flashy attire favored by saloon owners and their ilk. Still, Ezekiel kept the rifle ready as they approached, and his stance suggested a man prepared for trouble, even if he didn't expect it. "Ezekiel Boone," called the lead rider as they drew near the cabin. He was a man of middle years, with the weathered look of someone who spent his life outdoors, and his voice carried the accent of the American South. "That's right," Ezekiel replied, not lowering his weapon. "What's your business here?" "Name's William Carpenter," the man said, dismounting slowly and keeping his hands visible. "These are my sons, James and Thomas. We've got a ranch about 10 miles south of here down in Fletcher's Valley. We heard tell that you might have some new neighbors, and we wanted to extend a proper welcome." Clara felt some of the tension leave her shoulders, but she noticed that Ezekiel remained alert, his finger still near the trigger of his rifle. "That's neighborly of you," he said carefully, "but I'm curious how word traveled so fast. We haven't exactly been advertising our presence." Carpenter's face darkened slightly. "Word travels, especially when it involves what happened in Copper Ridge 3 days ago. My wife sent me to say that if those ladies need anything at all, we'd be honored to help. What happened there was a disgrace to every decent person in this territory." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Clara felt a flutter of hope in her chest. Perhaps not everyone in this harsh country was willing to stand by while innocence was degraded and sold like livestock. Ezekiel finally lowered his rifle, though he kept it within easy reach. "That's kind of your wife to say. The ladies are settling in well, but I'll pass along the offer." "There's something else," James Carpenter said, speaking for the first time. He was younger than his father, perhaps 25, with honest eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work honestly done. "There's been talk in town about what you did, Mr. Boone. Some folks are saying you made some powerful enemies, particularly Samuel Graves and his associates." "Let them talk," Ezekiel replied, but Clara heard the steel beneath his calm words. "I've faced worse than saloon owners and their hired thugs." "Maybe so," Thomas Carpenter interjected, But Graves has connections beyond Copper Ridge. He's got business dealings with some rough characters, and he doesn't take kindly to being humiliated in public. Father thought you should know that strangers have been asking questions about you, about where you live, and whether you're up here alone." The implications of this news settled over the valley like a shadow. Clara felt her newfound sense of security begin to crumble, replaced by the familiar taste of fear that had been her constant companion for so many years. Would they never be free from the consequences of that terrible day? Would the price of their dignity be eternal vigilance against those who would drag them back into darkness? "I appreciate the warning," Ezekiel said, and Clara could hear that he was taking the threat seriously. "If trouble comes calling, I'll be ready for it." William Carpenter nodded approvingly. "My boys and we've talked it over. If you need help, if things get difficult, you send word and we'll come running. What you did in Copper Ridge, that was the act of a righteous man, and righteous men shouldn't have to stand alone against the forces of evil." After the Carpenters had left, promising to return soon with their wives and a proper welcome feast, the 3 residents of the valley held a family meeting around their wooden table. The afternoon sun slanted through the cabin's single window, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the gravity of their discussion. "I won't lie to you," Ezekiel said, his voice heavy with responsibility and regret. "I knew when I bid on you ladies that there might be consequences. Men like Graves don't forget being crossed, and they don't forgive being made to look small in front of the whole town. But I want you to know that my decision to help you was made with full knowledge of the risks, and I don't regret it for a single second." Clara reached across the table and placed her hand over his scarred knuckles. "Mr. Boone, you saved our lives. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. We're family now, like you said, and family stands together when trouble comes calling." Bess nodded her agreement, her green eyes bright with determination that surprised even her sister. "I've been reading my Bible every night since we got here," she said, "and I keep coming back to the same verse, 'The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?' If God brought us together in this valley, then God will see us through whatever trials await us." The weeks that followed were among the happiest that Clara and Bess had ever known, despite the shadow of potential danger that hung over their mountain paradise. They fell into rhythms of daily life that felt as natural as breathing, each contributing their skills and strength to the small community they had formed. Clara's cooking transformed their simple meals into feasts that filled the cabin with warmth and wonderful aromas, while Bess's voice, raised in hymns and folk songs, provided a soundtrack of joy that echoed off the valley walls. Ezekiel proved to be not just a protector, but a teacher, showing them the secrets of mountain living that could mean the difference between comfort and hardship when winter arrived. He taught them to read the signs of changing weather in the behavior of birds and the smell of the wind. He showed them which plants could be eaten safely and which could kill, which animals were dangerous and which were merely wary of human presence. Under his patient guidance, Clara learned to milk the cow he had purchased from a neighboring ranch, her initial terror of the large, placid animal giving way to a comfortable routine that provided them with fresh milk and butter. Bess discovered a talent for tending the chickens, whose eggs added richness to their diet and whose antics provided endless entertainment during the long mountain evenings. The garden became Clara's special domain, and under her care it flourished beyond anything Ezekiel had ever achieved alone. She had inherited her mother's green thumb along with a deep understanding of how to coax life from reluctant soil. The vegetables grew in neat, abundant rows that spoke of careful attention and genuine love for the growing things that would sustain them through the coming winter. But it was in the evenings when the work was done and they gathered around their table or before the fireplace that their little family truly came alive. Ezekiel proved to be a master storyteller, his deep voice weaving tales of his adventures in the mountains, his encounters with bears and wolves, and the occasional outlaw who had wandered too far from the more civilized parts of the territory. His stories were exciting but never boastful, thrilling, but always tinged with respect for the wildness that surrounded their valley. Clara, in turn, shared memories of her mother painting word pictures of a woman who had possessed grace and dignity, even in the face of grinding poverty and an abusive husband. She spoke of lessons learned at her mother's knee about cooking and sewing and the importance of maintaining hope even when the world seemed determined to crush the spirit. Bess's contributions to these evening gatherings took the form of music that seemed to transform their humble cabin into a cathedral. Her voice, pure and strong and filled with genuine faith, lifted hymns toward the rafters that seemed to call down blessings on their small household. But she also knew folk songs and ballads that spoke of love and loss and the eternal human struggle to find meaning in a world that often seemed random and cruel. As August gave way to September, and the first touches of gold appeared in the aspen groves that dotted the mountainsides, their little family faced its first real test. Clara had been feeling unwell for several days, complaining of headaches and a general feeling of weakness that no amount of rest seemed to cure. At first, they attributed it to the adjustment to mountain living, the thinner air and the increased physical demands of their new life. But when she collapsed while working in the garden, her face flushed with fever and her breathing labored and painful, they knew they were facing something far more serious than simple fatigue. Ezekiel carried Clara's limp form into the cabin with a gentleness that belied his massive strength, his weathered face etched with worry lines that seemed to deepen with each labored breath she took. Bess hovered beside him, her hands fluttering uselessly as she watched her sister's flushed face and listened to the rattling cough that had developed over the past hour. "Lay her on the bed," Bess whispered, though there was no one around to overhear. "I'll get cool water and cloths." Clara's fever burned like a forge fire, and when Ezekiel placed his palm against her forehead, he could feel the heat radiating from her skin like warmth from sun-baked stone. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, punctuated by fits of coughing that seemed to tear at her chest with invisible claws. When she opened her eyes, they held the glassy brightness of delirium, and she looked at them without recognition. "The nearest doctor is in Copper Ridge," Ezekiel said grimly, his mind already calculating the time it would take to make the journey down the treacherous mountain trail. 20 miles of hard riding, and that's if the weather holds. Bess felt her heart sink like a stone dropped into deep water. The thought of returning to that hateful town, of facing the stares and whispers of people who had witnessed their humiliation, was almost unbearable. But the alternative was watching her sister slip away while they stood helpless in their mountain sanctuary. "We have to try," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her insides like a hungry wolf. "She's all the family I have left in this world, Mr. Boone. I can't lose her now, not when we've finally found something like happiness." Ezekiel nodded, understanding the weight of her words and the courage it took to speak them. "I'll saddle the horses and make ready for the journey. You stay with Clara. Keep her as cool as you can and try to get some water down her throat if she wakes up enough to swallow." As he prepared for the desperate ride to town, Ezekiel's mind raced through the dangers they would face. The trail was treacherous enough in daylight, but descending it with a fever-racked woman in the gathering dusk would test every skill he had learned in his years of mountain living. More troubling still was the prospect of riding into Copper Ridge, where Samuel Graves and his associates might well be waiting for just such an opportunity. But as he looked at Clara's flushed face and heard the terrible sound of her breathing, all such considerations faded into insignificance. She was family now, and family protected family, regardless of the personal cost. The journey down the mountain was a nightmare of switchbacks and rocky descents, with Clara wrapped in blankets and strapped securely to Ezekiel's horse, while Bess rode alongside, her face pale with worry and her lips moving in constant prayer. Every jolt and bounce of the trail seemed to drive Clara deeper into delirium and more than once Ezekiel had to stop to adjust her bindings and check that she was still breathing. The moon was high overhead by the time they reached the outskirts of Copper Ridge, its silver light casting long shadows across the sleeping town. Most of the windows were dark, but the saloon still blazed with yellow light, and the sound of raucous laughter and tinny piano music drifted through the night air like smoke from some infernal celebration. Dr. Marcus Heilman lived in a small house behind the town's only church, and it took several minutes of pounding on his door before a lamp flickered to life in an upstairs window. The doctor appeared at his door in nightclothes and spectacles, his gray hair disheveled and his face creased with the irritation of a man roused from much-needed sleep. "What's the meaning of this commotion?" he demanded, his German accent thick with drowsiness and displeasure. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" "Doctor, please," Bess said, stepping into the circle of lamplight with Clara's limp form visible in Ezekiel's arms behind her. "My sister is desperately ill. She's burning with fever and can barely breathe. We've ridden 20 miles in the dark to get here." The doctor's irritation vanished instantly as his professional instincts took over. He had practiced medicine for 30 years, first in the battlefields of Europe and then in the rough country of the American frontier, and he recognized genuine emergency when he saw it. "Bring her inside quickly," he commanded, stepping aside to let them enter his modest home. "Put her on the examination table in my office, and someone light more lamps. I'll need all the light I can get." The next hour passed in a blur of medical examination and growing concern. Dr. Heilman's face grew increasingly grave as he listened to Clara's chest, felt her pulse, and noted the rash that had begun to appear on her arms and neck. He asked questions in rapid succession, his voice taking on the clipped efficiency of a man accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "When did the fever begin? Has she complained of headaches, any nausea or stomach pain? Has she been exposed to anyone else who was ill?" Bess answered as best she could, her voice steady despite the terror that was eating at her heart like acid. She watched the doctor's face for any sign of hope, any indication that Clara's condition might not be as serious as it appeared. Finally, Dr. Heilman straightened up from his examination, his expression somber as a funeral shroud. He removed his spectacles and cleaned them with hands that trembled slightly, a gesture that did nothing to comfort the two people waiting anxiously for his diagnosis. "I'm afraid your sister has contracted scarlet fever," he said quietly, his words falling into the lamplight room like stones into still water. "It's a serious illness, and in her weakened condition—" He paused, searching for words that would convey the gravity of the situation without destroying all hope. "The next few days will be critical. If the fever breaks within 72 hours, she has a good chance of recovery. If not—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Both Bess and Ezekiel understood the implications of his diagnosis, and the weight of that knowledge settled over them like a shroud. "What can we do?" Ezekiel asked, his voice rough with emotion that he was struggling to contain. "There must be something, some treatment, some medicine." Dr. Heilman shook his head slowly. "With scarlet fever, we can only treat the symptoms and pray that the patient's constitution is strong enough to fight off the disease. Keep her cool, force fluids if she's conscious enough to swallow, and wait. I have some powders that might help with the fever, but beyond that—" He spread his hands in a gesture of professional helplessness. It was then that they heard the sound of approaching horses, the clip-clop of hooves on the wooden boardwalk outside growing louder as multiple riders drew near the doctor's house. Ezekiel's hand moved instinctively to his gun, and his body tensed with the alertness of a predator sensing danger. The door to the doctor's office burst open without ceremony, and Samuel Graves stepped inside with the swagger of a man who believed himself to be the law in this small corner of the world. Behind him came 3 other men, all wearing the hard faces and casual cruelty of professional gunfighters. The lamplight glinted off the metal of their weapons, and their eyes held the cold calculation of men who had come prepared for violence. Well, well, Graves said, his voice dripping with false joviality. Look what the mountain has brought down to civilization. The famous Ezekiel Boone and his purchases. Dr. Heilman stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. Mr. Graves, this is a medical facility, and I have a critically ill patient. I must insist that you and your men leave immediately. Graves laughed, a sound like breaking glass in the quiet room. Doctor, I think you misunderstand the situation here. These people are wanted for questioning in connection with certain irregularities in recent business transactions. I'm here in an official capacity. What authority? Ezekiel demanded, his voice low and dangerous as a growling wolf. You're no lawman, Graves. You're nothing but a saloon keeper with delusions of grandeur. Ah, but you're wrong there, mountain man. Graves pulled a badge from his vest pocket, its tin surface catching the lamplight with mocking gleams. Sheriff Williams has deputized me and my associates to investigate reports of suspicious activity in the mountains. Seems someone's been harboring stolen property. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and Bess felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. She understood now what was happening, saw the trap that had been carefully laid, and was now closing around them with the inevitability of winter. Those girls were legally purchased at a legitimate auction, Ezekiel said, his hand hovering near his gun butt. I have the papers to prove it. Papers can be forged, one of Graves's men said, speaking for the first time. He was a lean, predatory-looking individual with the pale eyes of a rattlesnake and scars that spoke of a violent profession. And seeing as how the girl's father has filed a complaint, saying they were taken against his will, that's a lie, Bess cried out, her voice cracking with outrage and fear. He sold us. He stood right there on that platform and took your money. The word of a confused girl against that of an upstanding citizen, Graves said with mock sadness. I'm afraid we'll have to sort this all out down at the jail where we can get to the truth of the matter. Dr. Heilman had heard enough. He stepped between Graves and his patients, his small frame bristling with the righteous anger of a man who had dedicated his life to healing. I absolutely forbid it. This woman is critically ill with scarlet fever. Moving her now could kill her, and I won't stand by and watch you commit murder in the name of whatever perverted justice you think you're dispensing. Scarlet fever? One of Graves' men asked, and Bess could hear the sudden uncertainty in his voice. Disease was the great equalizer on the frontier, respecting neither wealth nor status, nor the caliber of a man's gun. Highly contagious, Dr. Heilman confirmed, pressing his advantage. Anyone who comes in close contact with her risks infection, and I can tell you from experience that scarlet fever shows no mercy to adults. I've seen strong men reduced to children's corpses in a matter of days. For a moment the room hung in perfect balance, with fear of disease warring against greed, and the desire for revenge in the minds of Graves and his associates. Bess held her breath, praying that their terror of contagion would outweigh their appetite for cruelty. But Graves had not built his reputation by backing down from profitable confrontations, and his eyes glittered with the cunning of a man who saw opportunity in every crisis. Then we'll just have to quarantine them all, he said with apparent reasonableness. For the safety of the town, of course. We'll put them in the old mining shack on the edge of town where they can't spread their disease to decent folks. The mining shack he referred to was little more than a wooden box with a tin roof, abandoned when the silver played out and left to rot in the desert wind. It had no windows, no ventilation, and no protection from the elements beyond its questionable walls. In Clara's condition, it would be a death sentence as surely as a bullet to the head. You can't do this, Ezekiel said, and for the first time since they had known him, Bess heard desperation creep into his voice. She'll die in that place. Maybe she will. Maybe she won't, Graves replied with studied indifference. But that's not really my concern. My concern is making sure that justice is served, and that certain people learn the consequences of humiliating their betters in public. It was then that Bess made a decision that would have surprised everyone in that room, including herself. Drawing herself up to her full height, she stepped forward with the bearing of a queen addressing her court, her green eyes blazing with a fire that seemed to illuminate the entire room. "Mr. Graves," she said, her voice ringing with authority that came from somewhere deep within her soul. "You seem to be laboring under several misconceptions. First, that we are helpless victims who can be pushed around at your convenience. Second, that your petty revenge is worth risking the lives of everyone in this town. And third, that you have any legal authority to do what you're threatening to do." Graves blinked in surprise, clearly not having expected such a response from someone he had dismissed as a cowering victim. "Girl, you'd better watch your tongue or you'll find yourself in more trouble than you can handle." More trouble. Bess laughed, and the sound held no humor whatsoever. "Mr. Graves, 3 months ago, my sister and I were sold like cattle in your town square while good Christian people stood by and watched. We have faced degradation that would break most people, and we have survived. Do you really think your threats frighten us now?" She reached into her dress and pulled out a folded paper yellowed with age but still bearing the official seal of the Colorado Territory. "This is our mother's deed to a section of land in Fletcher's Valley land that was granted to her family by the government and passed down through proper legal channels. Land that includes mineral rights and water rights that make it worth considerably more than the pittance our father received for selling us." The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt, and Bess could see the sudden calculation in Graves's eyes as he reassessed the situation. Land with mineral rights was serious money in Colorado Territory, serious enough to change the entire dynamic of what he had assumed was a simple matter of revenge. Moreover, Bess continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "Dr. Heilman is absolutely correct about the contagious nature of my sister's illness. But what he hasn't told you is that scarlet fever has an incubation period of several days. My sister and I have been living in close quarters, sharing meals and sleeping in the same room. If she has scarlet fever, then I almost certainly have been exposed as well." She stepped closer to Graves and had the satisfaction of seeing him retreat a step despite himself. "So if you want to drag us to your mining shack, if you want to continue this charade of legal authority, then you'll be exposing yourself and your men to a disease that could kill every one of you. Is your revenge really worth dying for, Mr. Graves?" The standoff that followed seemed to stretch into eternity, with the only sounds being Clara's labored breathing and the distant noise of revelry from the saloons down the street. Graves's men were looking increasingly uncomfortable, their eyes darting between their leader and the woman who had just called his bluff with the cool calculation of a professional gambler. It was Dr. Heilman who finally broke the silence, his voice carrying the authority of medical expertise and moral certainty. "I'm declaring an official quarantine of this building and everyone in it," he announced. "As the only qualified physician in Copper Ridge, I have the legal authority to take whatever measures I deem necessary to prevent the spread of infectious disease. Anyone who violates this quarantine will be subject to territorial law, which includes charges of reckless endangerment and attempted murder." Graves' face had gone purple with rage, but he was trapped by the very laws he had been trying to manipulate for his own purposes. Territorial health regulations were serious business, backed by the full authority of the federal government, and even a man of his influence couldn't openly flout them without risking consequences far beyond his ability to handle. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice thick with frustrated anger. "Not by a long shot. You people have made an enemy today that you'll regret for the rest of your very short lives." "Get out," Ezekiel said quietly, but his voice carried the promise of violence that made even Graves's hardened gunmen take notice. "Get out now before I decide that protecting my family is worth whatever consequences might follow." After they had gone, slamming the door behind them with enough force to rattle the windows, the three people left in the doctor's office stood in stunned silence, trying to process what had just occurred. Clara continued to burn with fever, oblivious to the drama that had just played out around her unconscious form. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most foolish," Dr. Heilman said, finally looking at Bess with something approaching admiration. "Probably both." Bess sank into a chair beside her sister's bed, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation now draining away and leaving her feeling hollow and shaky. "I couldn't let them take her to that awful place," she whispered. "She would have died, and I would have lost the only family I have left." "You may have bought us some time," Ezekiel said grimly, "but Graves isn't the type to give up easily. He'll be back probably with more men and a better plan. We need to be ready for whatever comes next." The next 3 days passed in a haze of desperate nursing and constant vigilance. Clara's fever raged like a forest fire, rising and falling in cycles that left her sometimes lucid enough to recognize her sister, and sometimes lost in delirium that transported her to places and times that existed only in her fevered imagination. Bess rarely left her side, spooning water between her cracked lips and bathing her burning skin with cool cloths that seemed to provide only momentary relief. Dr. Heilman proved to be more than just a skilled physician during those dark hours. He also served as their guardian and protector, using his medical authority to maintain the quarantine that kept Graves and his men at bay. The good doctor seemed to relish his role as an obstacle to the saloon owner's plans, and more than once Bess caught him smiling grimly as he turned away visitors who claimed official business with his patients. On the second night, when Clara's fever spiked so high that she began having convulsions, Bess thought she was going to lose her sister, despite all their efforts. She held Clara's thrashing form and wept tears that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul, while Ezekiel stood by, feeling helpless in the face of an enemy he couldn't fight with bullets or strength. "Please, God," Bess prayed aloud, her voice breaking with exhaustion and despair. "Please don't take her from me now. We've been through so much, come so far. Please let her live to see the happiness that finally seems within our reach." It was Ezekiel who suggested they sing to her, remembering how music had always seemed to calm Clara during their peaceful evenings in the mountain cabin. Bess began with "Amazing Grace," her voice soft and trembling at first, but growing stronger as the familiar words and melody seemed to reach through Clara's delirium and touch something deep within her fevered mind. As the hymn filled the small room, something miraculous happened. Clara's thrashing gradually subsided and her breathing became less labored. The lines of pain that had etched themselves across her face began to soften, and for the first time in days she seemed to be resting peacefully rather than fighting invisible demons. They maintained their vigil through that long night, taking turns singing the hymns and folk songs that had become the soundtrack of their mountain shaman family. Dr. Heilman, despite his advanced years and his own exhaustion, refused to leave them alone, checking Clara's pulse and temperature at regular intervals and adjusting her treatment based on subtle changes in her condition. As dawn broke over Copper Ridge on the third day, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to promise hope after the long darkness, Clara's fever finally broke. The heat that had radiated from her skin like warmth from a forge began to subside, and her breathing became deeper and more regular. When she opened her eyes for the first time in 3 days and looked at her sister with recognition and awareness, Bess felt her heart soar like a bird released from captivity. "Clara," she whispered, hardly daring to believe that the crisis had finally passed. "Bess," Clara replied, her voice weak but unmistakably her own. "What happened? Where are we?" As they explained the events of the past few days, Clara's face grew pale with something other than illness. The knowledge that Graves had tried to use her condition as an opportunity for revenge, that her sister had faced down armed men while she lay helpless with fever, filled her with a mixture of gratitude and determination that burned brighter than any fire. "We can't stay here," she said, struggling to sit up despite her weakness. "Every moment we remain in this town puts Dr. Heilman at risk. and gives Graves more time to plan whatever evil he's cooking up next. Dr. Heilman, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward with a smile that transformed his tired face. "Actually, my dear, I think you'll find that our Mr. Graves has had other concerns to occupy his attention while you've been recovering." He moved to the window and pulled back the curtain, revealing a scene that made all three of his patients gasp in surprise. The street outside was filled with horses and wagons, and men in the uniforms of the Territorial Marshal's office were moving purposefully between the buildings with the efficiency of a military operation. "It seems," Dr. Heilman continued with evident satisfaction, "that someone sent word to the territorial authorities about certain irregularities in local law enforcement, including the illegal sale of human beings and the corruption of the sheriff's office. Marshal David Harrison arrived yesterday with a full company of federal deputies, and they've been quite busy arresting various individuals on charges ranging from human trafficking to conspiracy to defraud the territorial government." Through the window, they could see Samuel Graves being led away in chains, his face a mask of rage and disbelief as he realized that his schemes had finally caught up with him. Sheriff Williams followed behind him, his badge removed and his hands bound, looking like a man who had just awakened from a pleasant dream to find himself living in a nightmare. "Who?" Ezekiel asked, though his voice suggested he might already know the answer. Dr. Heilman's smile grew even broader. "It seems that William Carpenter and his sons made quite an impression on Marshal Harrison when they rode to Denver to report what they had witnessed in Copper Ridge. Apparently, the federal government takes a dim view of territorial officials who allow the sale of human beings in direct violation of the Constitution and federal law. As they prepared to leave Copper Ridge for what they all hoped would be the final time, Bess reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them to this moment. 3 days ago, they had been facing the prospect of losing Clara to disease and themselves to the revenge of evil men. Now their enemies were in chains, Clara was recovering, and they were free to return to their mountain sanctuary with the knowledge that justice had finally been served. The wagon ride back up the mountain trail was a celebration in itself, with Clara wrapped in blankets and propped against soft pillows, while Bess sat beside her holding her hand and singing the songs that had helped pull her back from the brink of death. Ezekiel drove with the steady competence that had become so familiar and comforting, his presence a constant reminder that they were no longer alone in their struggles against a hostile world. As their valley came into view, nestled like a green jewel among the granite peaks, all three of them felt their hearts lift with the joy of coming home. The cabin looked exactly as they had left it, with smoke still rising from the chimney where Ezekiel had banked the fire before their desperate journey to town. The garden showed signs of neglect from their absence, but the vegetables continued to grow with the patience of living things that understood the cycles of attention and abandonment that marked human existence. That evening, as Clara rested in the comfortable bed while Bess prepared a simple meal from their mountain stores, they talked quietly about the events that had brought them to this point and the future that now lay before them. The threat of Graves and his associates had been removed, but they all understood that their mountain paradise was not immune to the forces of change and conflict that swept across the territory like wildfire. The autumn of 1887 brought changes to their mountain valley that went far beyond the turning of the leaves from green to gold. Clara's recovery from scarlet fever had been complete, but it had left all three members of their unlikely family with a deeper understanding of how precious and fragile their happiness truly was. The crisis had also revealed something else, something that would prove to be far more dangerous than Samuel Graves and his hired guns had ever been. It was Bess who first noticed the surveyor's marks carved into the trees along the eastern ridge of their valley. She had been gathering late berries for the preserves that would help sustain them through the coming winter when she spotted the crude symbols scratched into the bark of an ancient pine. At first, she thought they might be Indian markings, or perhaps the casual vandalism of passing travelers, but something about their precise, deliberate nature made her examine them more closely. "Ezekiel," she called as she hurried back to the cabin, her voice tight with concern. "I think you need to see something." He listened to her description with growing unease, his weathered face settling into the grim lines that had become familiar during their recent troubles. Without a word, he retrieved his rifle and followed her back to the marked trees, his experienced eyes reading the signs with the fluency of someone who had spent years in the wilderness. "Survey markers," he confirmed, running his fingers over the fresh cuts in the bark. "Someone's been measuring our valley, mapping it for—" He paused, his jaw tightening as the implications became clear. "For the railroad." The word fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of anxiety spreading through their peaceful world. The railroad meant progress to some, prosperity to others, but to families like theirs settled in isolated valleys, far from the main routes of commerce, it often meant displacement and the destruction of everything they had worked to build. Over the following days, more evidence of the surveyor's presence became apparent. Stakes driven into the ground marked elevation points and property boundaries, while blazed trails showed where men with instruments had tramped through areas that had known only the footsteps of deer and mountain cats for centuries. Each new discovery felt like a violation, as if strangers had been peering through their windows and inventorying their most precious possessions. It was Clara who finally voiced what they were all thinking as they sat around their table one evening, the early October wind rattling the cabin's shutters with the promise of winter storms to come. "They want our land," she said simply, her voice steady despite the fear that lurked behind her words. "Someone knows about the valley, knows about the water and the good soil, and they want to take it from us." Ezekiel nodded slowly, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight from the hearth. "The question is whether they'll try to buy us out or simply claim the land under some legal pretext. Either way, we're going to need help if we want to keep what we've built here." The help came from an unexpected source 3 days later when preacher Isaiah Matthews arrived at their cabin leading a pack mule loaded with supplies and carrying a leather satchel that would prove to contain documents of vital importance to their future. The preacher was a tall, spare man with the kind of deep-lined face that spoke of years spent under the open sky, ministering to scattered congregations across the frontier. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, and his dark eyes held the calm certainty of someone whose faith had been tested by fire and found unbreakable. "Brother Ezekiel," he said as he dismounted from his horse, "I bring greetings from the Lord and urgent news from the territorial capital. May I impose upon your hospitality for a few days while we discuss matters of mutual concern?" They welcomed him warmly, for preacher Matthews had been a frequent visitor to their valley over the years, providing spiritual guidance and news from the outside world to their small community. But this visit felt different from the beginning, charged with an urgency that had nothing to do with pastoral care and everything to do with the survival of their mountain sanctuary. Over supper, the preacher explained the purpose of his visit with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to delivering important information clearly and completely. "I've just come from Denver," he began, "where I had occasion to speak with certain officials in the territorial government about recent developments in this region. It seems that the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad has filed claims on a significant portion of land in this area, including your valley." The words hit them like physical blows, confirming their worst fears while revealing the scope of the threat they faced. Bess felt her stomach clench with the familiar sensation of powerlessness that had dominated her life before Ezekiel had rescued them from the auction block. "On what grounds?" Ezekiel asked, his voice carefully controlled, despite the anger that burned in his eyes. "Eminent domain primarily," Matthews replied, setting down his coffee cup with the deliberate movements of a man choosing his words carefully. They claim the land is needed for the greater good of territorial development and that the railroad's construction will benefit the entire region. They also suggest that current occupants lack proper legal title to the property in question. Clara's face flushed with indignation. But this is Ezekiel's land. He's lived here for 8 years, built the cabin with his own hands, cleared the fields, and dug the well. Surely that gives him some claim under territorial law. Matthews nodded approvingly. Squatters' rights would normally apply, yes, but the railroad has significant political influence and they've retained lawyers who specialize in finding legal loopholes that allow them to acquire land with minimal compensation to current occupants. He reached into his leather satchel and withdrew a thick sheaf of papers bound with red ribbon. However, they may have overlooked certain historical factors that could complicate their plans considerably. The documents he spread across their wooden table were old, some dating back more than 20 years, but they had been carefully preserved and bore the official seals of various governmental agencies. As Matthews explained their significance, a picture began to emerge that transformed their understanding of the valley's legal status completely. This valley was originally granted to the territorial government by the Federal Land Office in 1867. The preacher explained, pointing to a map that showed their property marked in precise detail. The grant was made specifically for the purpose of establishing a way station for travelers crossing the mountains, and it included provisions that the land could never be sold or transferred to private commercial interests without the express consent of Congress. Ezekiel leaned forward, studying the documents with the intensity of a man whose entire future might depend on understanding their contents. So the railroad can't just take the land. Not legally, no, Matthews confirmed, but that doesn't mean they won't try. I've seen too many cases where powerful interests simply ignored inconvenient laws and dared anyone to challenge them in court. The difference in this case is that we have documentary proof of the government's original intentions, and we have allies in Denver who are willing to support our position. Those allies, it turned out, included Territorial Judge Harrison Parker, the same federal official whose intervention had led to the arrest of Samuel Graves and the cleanup of corruption in Copper Ridge. Judge Parker had taken a personal interest in their case, partly because of the injustices they had already suffered, and partly because he saw their struggle as a test of whether the rule of law meant anything in the territories. The judge has agreed to hear our petition for an injunction against the railroad's land grab, Matthews continued, but we'll need to present our case in Denver within the next 2 weeks. That means gathering witnesses, organizing our documentary evidence, and preparing for what will certainly be a fierce legal battle. The prospect of leaving their valley again, of venturing back into the world of courts and lawyers and men who saw justice as a commodity to be bought and sold, filled all 3 residents with dread. But the alternative was to lose everything they had built together, to watch their mountain sanctuary be destroyed in the name of progress and profit. "We'll go," Clara said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "We'll fight them with their own laws and their own courts, and we'll show them that some things can't be taken just because powerful men want them." The 2 weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and anxiety. Ezekiel spent long hours with Matthews, reviewing property boundaries and gathering evidence of the improvements he had made to the land over his years of residence. Clara and Bess worked feverishly to preserve and store the harvest from their garden, knowing that their absence might stretch longer than anticipated and that they would need every bit of food to sustain them through the winter. But even as they prepared for their legal battle, new troubles were brewing closer to home. The railroad surveyors had been followed by other men, rougher individuals, who seemed less interested in measuring the land than in measuring the people who occupied it. These were not the neat professional engineers who had marked the trees, but hard-faced men with the look of hired muscle about them. It was William Carpenter who brought word of this new development, riding up the mountain trail with his son James and 2 of his ranch hands, all of them armed and alert for trouble. The rancher's weathered face was grim as he dismounted in front of the cabin, and his first words confirmed their worst suspicions. "They're not waiting for the courts," he announced without preamble. "The railroads hired gun hands to start putting pressure on folks they want off their land. 3 families down in Fletcher's Valley have already been burned out supposedly by Indian raiders, but everyone knows Indians don't usually leave railroad company scrip scattered around their campsites." The news hit them like a physical blow, confirming what they had all secretly feared but hoped would not come to pass. The railroad was not content to wait for legal proceedings that might go against them. They were prepared to use violence and intimidation to clear the land they wanted, relying on the isolation of their targets and the general lawlessness of the frontier to hide their crimes. "How many men are we talking about?" Ezekiel asked, his voice taking on the hard edge that spoke of a soldier's mind calculating odds and possibilities. 8 or 10 in this immediate area," James Carpenter replied, "but they've got more they can call in if needed. The word is they're led by a man named Silas Cutter, ex-cavalry officer, who got cashiered for brutality against Indian prisoners. He's got a reputation for getting results no matter what methods he has to use." Bess felt her blood turn to ice at the mention of Cutter's name. She had heard stories about men like him, hard cases who had learned their trade in the Indian wars and then sold their skills to the highest bidder when the fighting moved on. Such men had no conscience about the methods they used or the innocents who got caught in their path. "We need to get word to Judge Parker," Matthews said urgently. "If the railroad is resorting to violence, the federal marshals need to be brought in immediately." But even as he spoke, they all knew that help from Denver was days away at best, while the immediate threat was growing closer with each passing hour. That very evening, as the sun set behind the western peaks and painted their valley in shades of blood and gold, they saw the first signs that their sanctuary was about to become a battlefield. Smoke rose from the direction of the lower valley, too much smoke and in the wrong place to be a normal campfire or chimney. As they watched in growing alarm, the orange glow of flames became visible through the trees, and the acrid smell of burning wood drifted up the mountainside on the evening breeze. "The Hendricks place," Carpenter said grimly, recognizing the location of the fire. "Old Tom and his wife Mary been homesteading down there for 12 years. Good people, never harmed a soul in their lives." They watched helplessly as the flames consumed the small cabin that had been someone's home, someone's dream of peace and prosperity in the wilderness. The fire burned through the night, visible for miles as a beacon of the railroad's intentions and a warning to anyone who might consider standing in their way. The next morning brought Silas Cutter himself to their valley, riding at the head of a column of hard-faced men who sat their horses with the casual arrogance of soldiers accustomed to taking what they wanted by force. Cutter was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest, with the kind of scarred hands that spoke of violence as both profession and pleasure. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of a predator sizing up potential prey. He rode right up to their cabin as if he owned it, dismounting with theatrical casualness while his men spread out in a semicircle that effectively surrounded the small building. The message was clear: without being spoken, resistance was futile, and submission was the only rational choice. "Morning, folks," Cutter said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that mocked courtesy, while emphasizing his contempt for those he addressed. "Beautiful valley you've got here. Shame it's going to have to be relocated to make way for progress." Ezekiel stepped out onto the cabin's small porch, his rifle held casually but ready for immediate use. Behind him, Clara and Bess stood in the doorway, their faces pale but determined, while Preacher Matthews positioned himself where he could serve as both witness and protector. "Mr. Cutter, I presume," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that had once commanded soldiers in battle. "I'm afraid you're trespassing on private property. I'll have to ask you and your men to leave immediately." Cutter laughed, a sound like breaking glass in the morning stillness. Private property. That's a good one, mountain man. This land belongs to the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, now acquired fair and square through proper legal channels. You're the one who's trespassing. Funny thing about legal channels, Matthews interjected, stepping forward with the calm dignity that marked his calling. They require actual legal documents properly filed and recorded. I don't suppose you have such documents with you? The preacher's challenge clearly caught Cutter off guard, and for a moment his confident facade cracked slightly. But he recovered quickly, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his gun in a gesture that was both casual and threatening. I don't need papers to do my job, preacher man, he said with renewed arrogance. I've got all the authority I need right here. He patted his holstered weapon with obvious satisfaction. Now you folks can make this easy on yourselves by packing up and moving on, or you can make it hard. Either way, you'll be gone by sundown tomorrow. It was then that Clara did something that surprised everyone present, including herself. She stepped past Ezekiel onto the porch, her chin raised and her green eyes blazing with a fire that seemed to light up the entire valley. Mr. Cutter, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the space between them. I want you to look around this valley. Look at the garden we've planted with our own hands, the cabin we've built from trees. We cut ourselves the well. We dug one bucket of dirt at a time. This isn't just land to us. This is our home, our family, our entire world. She gestured toward the neat rows of vegetables, the carefully tended flower beds, the small cemetery plot where they had buried 2 travelers who had died passing through their valley the previous winter. Every inch of this place represents hope and hard work and the dream that people can build something beautiful in this harsh world. And you want us to abandon it all because some railroad company has decided they want what we've built. Cutter's face had darkened during her speech, and his hand had moved closer to his weapon. Lady, I don't care if you've got the Garden of Eden up here. When the railroad wants land, the railroad gets land. That's just the way things work in the real world. The real world. Bess stepped forward to join her sister, her voice ringing with the clear notes of righteous anger. The real world includes laws and courts and the rights of citizens to be secure in their homes. Or have you forgotten that this is America, not some lawless territory where might makes right? Might has always made right on the frontier, girl. One of Cutter's men called out, his voice thick with contempt, and we've got more might than you can handle. But even as the confrontation escalated, help was approaching from an unexpected direction. The sound of many horses echoed off the valley walls, and within minutes a large group of riders crested the eastern ridge and began descending toward the cabin. At their head rode William Carpenter and his sons, but they were followed by what appeared to be every able-bodied man from 3 counties, all armed and all wearing expressions of grim determination. Well, well, Carpenter called out as his improvised army spread out across the valley floor. Looks like we got here just in time for the entertainment. Cutter's men shifted nervously in their saddles as they realized they were suddenly outnumbered by more than 3 to 1. The confident arrogance that had marked their leader's approach began to evaporate as the reality of their tactical situation became apparent. This is a private matter, Carpenter, Cutter snarled, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. It doesn't concern you or your friends. Funny thing about that, James Carpenter replied, his young voice carrying surprising authority. When railroad toughs start burning out honest homesteaders and threatening decent folks with violence, it concerns every person in this territory who believes in justice and the rule of law. It was then that Preacher Matthews stepped forward, holding aloft a document that bore the official seal of the territorial court. Gentlemen, he announced in the carrying voice he used for outdoor sermons, I have here an official injunction from Judge Harrison Parker, Federal District Court, ordering the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad and all its agents to cease and desist from any interference with the lawful occupants of this valley pending a full hearing on the validity of their land claims. The document seemed to have a magical effect on the assembled crowd. Cutter's men looked uncertainly at their leader, while the homesteaders and ranchers who had come to help pressed closer to hear every word of the legal proclamation that might save their friend's sanctuary. Moreover, Matthews continued, the injunction specifically prohibits any acts of intimidation, violence, or destruction of property, and authorizes federal marshals to arrest anyone who violates its terms. I should mention that Marshal Harrison and a full company of federal deputies are currently en route to this area and should arrive within the next few hours. Cutter's face had gone red with frustrated rage, but he was trapped by the legal reality that Matthews had just presented. Federal injunctions were serious business backed by the full authority of the United States government, and even railroad companies hesitated to openly defy such orders. "This isn't over," he finally said, his voice thick with barely controlled fury. "The railroad has lawyers too, and they don't give up easily. You may have won this round, but the game is far from finished." As Cutter and his men rode away, their departure watched by scores of witnesses who would remember every detail of the encounter, the residents of the valley felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had won a victory, but they all understood that it was only the first battle in what promised to be a long and difficult war. That evening, as their impromptu army of supporters shared a celebration meal around fires built in the meadow beside the cabin, Clara found herself reflecting on the strange turns her life had taken since that terrible day on the auction block in Copper Ridge. 6 months ago, she had been powerless, voiceless, treated like property to be bought and sold. Now she was part of a family that commanded respect and loyalty from people across 3 counties fighting for principles that went far beyond their personal survival. "Penny for your thoughts," Ezekiel said, settling beside her on the cabin's porch steps as the last light faded from the western sky. "I was thinking about choices," she replied, her voice soft but clear in the mountain stillness. 6 months ago, I thought I had no choices left, that life was just something that happened to me rather than something I could control. Now I realize that we always have choices, even when they're all terrible ones. The choice to stand up or give in to fight or surrender to hope or despair. Ezekiel nodded slowly, understanding more than she had spoken. "And what choice are you making now?" Clara looked out over their valley where the lights of campfires twinkled like earthbound stars, and the voices of friends and allies created a symphony of human solidarity. "I'm choosing to fight," she said firmly. "For this valley, for our family, for the principle that people should be able to build something beautiful without having it stolen by those who are stronger or richer or more ruthless." As if summoned by her words, Bess emerged from the cabin carrying her Bible and wearing the serene expression that always marked her moments of deepest faith. "I've been reading about David and Goliath," she announced, settling on the steps beside her sister, "about how the smallest person can defeat the mightiest enemy when they're fighting for what's right. The railroad is certainly Goliath in this story," Ezekiel observed with a slight smile. "The question is whether we can find the right stone for our slingshot." The answer to that question would come sooner than any of them expected, and from a direction that none of them had anticipated. But as they sat together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by friends and sustained by hope, they felt ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. They had found each other against impossible odds, built something precious in the wilderness, and discovered that even the smallest family could command the loyalty and respect of an entire community when they stood for principles that mattered. The real test of their strength and unity was yet to come, but they would face it together as they had faced everything else since that day when a mountain man's simple act of human decency had changed all their lives forever. The stone for their slingshot came in the form of a leather pouch that arrived with the federal marshals 3 days later, carried by a young clerk whose nervous demeanor suggested he understood the importance of the documents he bore. Marshal David Harrison himself led the federal contingent, The same man whose intervention had cleansed Copper Ridge of its corruption, and his presence brought with it the full authority of the United States government. But it was the contents of that leather pouch that would prove to be the railroad's undoing. Inside were photocopies of financial records seized from the Denver and Rio Grande offices during a federal investigation into their land acquisition practices. The documents revealed a web of bribery, fraud, and illegal manipulation that stretched from the territorial capital to Washington, D.C. itself. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marshal Harrison announced as he spread the damning papers across their wooden table, "what we have here is evidence of the largest land fraud scheme in the history of Colorado Territory. The railroad has been systematically bribing territorial officials to falsify land records, creating fictional homestead claims that could then be purchased for pennies on the dollar, and using violence to drive off legitimate settlers whose property they coveted." Preacher Matthews examined the documents with the careful attention of a man who understood their significance. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "With this evidence, we're not just defending our right to remain on this land. We're exposing a criminal conspiracy that reaches to the highest levels of territorial government." The implications were staggering. If the evidence was presented correctly, it could not only save their valley, but bring down the entire corrupt network that had been systematically stealing land from honest settlers across the territory. But it also meant that the stakes of their struggle had just increased exponentially, and their enemies would now fight with the desperation of cornered animals. The railroad's response was swift and brutal. Within hours of the marshal's arrival, telegraph lines to the valley were cut, preventing communication with the outside world. Scouts reported armed men moving through the mountain passes, cutting off escape routes and establishing positions that would allow them to control access to the valley. Silas Cutter had returned with reinforcements, and this time he was not interested in intimidation or legal niceties. "They mean to lay siege to us," William Carpenter observed grimly as he studied the reports from his sons and ranch hands who had been monitoring the railroad's movements. "Cut us off from supplies and communication, then wait for winter to do their work for them. By spring, they figure we'll be weak enough to finish off without too much trouble." The strategy was both simple and effective. The valley's isolation, which had always been its greatest protection, now became its greatest vulnerability. Food supplies that might last a small family through the winter would be stretched dangerously thin, feeding the dozens of men who had come to defend their mountain sanctuary. Water was plentiful from the stream, but fuel for heating and cooking was limited, and the early snow that had already begun to dust the highest peaks promised a long, hard winter ahead. But if their enemies had underestimated anything, it was the resourcefulness and determination of the community that had rallied to defend the valley. Clara found herself appointed as quartermaster, organizing food supplies and rationing systems with the efficiency of someone who had learned to make do with very little. Her mother's old recipes proved invaluable for stretching ingredients and creating nutritious meals from whatever was available. Bess took charge of communications, using her clear voice and natural authority to coordinate the efforts of wives and daughters who remained on the surrounding ranches. Despite the cut telegraph lines, messages still flowed through the network of riders and signals that connected the scattered homesteads like an invisible web of solidarity and mutual support. Ezekiel and the other men organized defensive positions and patrol schedules, drawing on military experience gained in various conflicts to create a defense system that would make the valley costly to attack. They established watch posts on the surrounding ridges, cleared fields of fire around the cabin and other key buildings, and dug rifle pits that could protect defenders from both gunfire and the harsh mountain weather. As October deepened into November and the first serious snows began to fall, the siege settled into a deadly routine of vigilance and endurance. Cutter's men maintained their positions in the passes, occasionally probing the valley's defenses with small raids that accomplished little beyond keeping the defenders on constant alert. The railroad forces were clearly waiting for winter to weaken their opponents, but they had failed to account for the depth of commitment that drove the mountain community. It was during one of these probing attacks that tragedy struck their small family. Clara had been helping to tend the wounded from a skirmish near the eastern pass when a stray bullet fired from an impossible distance by a railroad sniper shattered the cabin's window and struck her in the shoulder. The wound was not immediately life-threatening, but infection set in quickly in the primitive conditions of their besieged valley. For 3 days, Clara burned with fever, while Bess and the other women fought to save her life using the limited medical supplies available to them. Dr. Heilman, who had insisted on joining the defenders despite his advanced age, worked tirelessly to clean and dress the wound, but his resources were limited, and his patient's condition continued to deteriorate. "She's not getting better," Bess whispered to Ezekiel on the third night, her voice breaking with exhaustion and despair. "The infection is spreading, and we don't have the medicines she needs. If we don't get her to a real hospital soon—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood that Clara was dying slowly and painfully, while the railroad siege made it impossible to get her the medical attention that might save her life. The cruel irony was not lost on anyone. She had survived being sold like cattle, had overcome scarlet fever through sheer determination, only to be brought down by a bullet fired by men who cared nothing for the lives they destroyed in pursuit of profit. It was then that Marshal Harrison made a decision that would transform the entire conflict. On the 4th morning of Clara's illness, as her fever spiked to dangerous levels and her breathing became increasingly labored, he stood up in the center of the cabin and made an announcement that stunned everyone present. "I'm going to break the siege," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of federal law and personal conviction. "Not with force of arms, though we have that, if necessary, but with the one weapon the railroad can't fight against: the truth." He gathered his federal deputies and the strongest riders among the defenders, preparing for a desperate dash through the railroad's lines that would carry copies of the incriminating documents to newspapers in Denver, Colorado Springs, and even as far as San Francisco. If the story of the railroad's corruption and the siege of innocent homesteaders could reach the public, the resulting outcry would force territorial and federal authorities to intervene decisively. The plan was audacious and dangerous, requiring riders to navigate treacherous mountain trails in increasingly severe weather while avoiding patrols of armed railroad operatives. But it represented their only hope of breaking the deadlock that was slowly killing Clara and wearing down the entire community. Ezekiel volunteered to lead one of the courier teams, but Marshal Harrison refused his request, with the firm authority of a federal official accustomed to making life and death decisions. "You're needed here," Harrison said simply. "Your family needs you, and this community looks to you for leadership. We'll get the word out, but you need to hold things together until help arrives." The breakout attempt began at dawn on a day when fresh snow had made the mountain trails treacherous, but also provided cover for the riders attempting to penetrate the railroad's siege lines. 3 teams set out in different directions, each carrying copies of the crucial documents and instructions to reach specific newspapers and territorial officials who could be trusted to act on the evidence. The first team was captured within hours, their riders taken prisoner by railroad operatives who had anticipated the attempt and prepared accordingly. The second team made it further but was forced to turn back when they encountered a blizzard that made further travel impossible. But the third team, led by James Carpenter and including 2 federal deputies, managed to slip through the siege lines and disappear into the vast wilderness beyond. While they waited for word from the outside world, the defenders of the valley faced their darkest hours. Clara's condition continued to deteriorate, and other members of their community began to show signs of the strain that constant vigilance and inadequate nutrition were placing on even the strongest constitutions. Food supplies dwindled faster than anticipated, As the siege stretched into its third week and the early onset of severe winter weather made hunting and foraging increasingly difficult, it was Bess who provided the spiritual strength that kept their community from despair during those terrible days. Her voice, raised in hymns and prayers throughout the long mountain nights, became a beacon of hope that reminded everyone why they were fighting and what they stood to lose if they surrendered to the railroad's demands. "I've been reading the book of Nehemiah," she announced one evening as they gathered for their meager supper, "about how the Israelites rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem while their enemies tried to stop them. They worked with tools in one hand and weapons in the other, never giving up despite constant attacks and threats." She looked around the cabin at the faces of friends and family who had risked everything to defend their mountain sanctuary. "That's what we're doing here," she continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "We're building something precious and beautiful while evil men try to tear it down. But we have something they don't have. We have faith, and we have each other, and we have the knowledge that what we're fighting for is right." Her words seemed to kindle fresh determination in hearts that had begun to despair, and even Clara, weak though she was, managed a smile that reminded everyone why their struggle was worth whatever price they might have to pay. The turning point came on the day before Thanksgiving, when the sound of approaching horses echoed off the valley walls with a different quality than the cautious patrols they had grown accustomed to hearing. These were riders in a hurry, moving with purpose rather than stealth, and their arrival was heralded by shouts of joy rather than challenges from the sentries. James Carpenter led the returning party, but he was followed by a column of blue-uniformed cavalry that brought with it the authority of the federal government, and the promise of justice finally served. At their head rode Colonel Robert Mackenzie, a career military officer whose reputation for integrity and decisive action had made him the natural choice to clean up the mess that the railroad investigation had revealed. "Citizens of this valley," Colonel Mackenzie announced as his troops spread out to secure the area, "I bring greetings from the President of the United States and news that will interest you greatly. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad's charter has been revoked, pending a complete investigation of their criminal activities. All land claims filed by the railroad in this territory have been declared null and void, and federal warrants have been issued for the arrest of Silas Cutter and his associates on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder." The news struck the assembled defenders like lightning, too wonderful to be immediately believed, but too official to be doubted. The siege was over, their enemies were in full retreat, and their valley was safe from the threat that had consumed their lives for weeks. But even more important to their small family was the Army surgeon who accompanied Colonel Mackenzie's column. Dr. William Thompson was a skilled physician with years of experience treating battlefield injuries, and he brought with him medical supplies that had been desperately needed for Clara's recovery. "The bullet wound is healing well, Dr. Thompson announced after his examination, but the infection will require aggressive treatment with the newest medicines available. Fortunately, I have sulfur compounds and other drugs that should prove effective against the particular type of bacteria we're dealing with." Under his expert care, Clara's recovery was swift and complete. Within days, her fever broke permanently, and her strength began to return with the miraculous speed of youth, triumphing over adversity. The color returned to her cheeks, and her laughter once again filled their cabin with the sound of joy that had been absent for too long. As Christmas approached and the legal proceedings against the railroad's criminal conspiracy moved forward in courts across the territory, life in their mountain valley gradually returned to the peaceful rhythms that had marked their existence before the crisis began. The federal government, embarrassed by the revelation of corruption in territorial administration, had issued clear title deeds to all legitimate homesteaders in the region, ensuring that families like theirs would never again face the threat of arbitrary displacement. The railroad, stripped of its charter and facing criminal prosecution of its leadership, abandoned all claims to land in their area and retreated to more conventional business practices under federal oversight. Silas Cutter and most of his men were captured during their retreat and faced trial for their crimes, while those who escaped disappeared into the vast wilderness of the frontier, their reputations too damaged to find employment, even in the rough country they had once terrorized. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell softly outside their cabin windows, and the warmth of their fire created a golden circle of light and love, the three members of their unlikely family gathered for a celebration that marked not just the birth of Christ, but the rebirth of their own hopes and dreams. The table was laden with food contributed by neighbors and friends from across the territory, while gifts handmade during the long winter evenings testified to the bonds of affection that had grown stronger through shared struggle. "I want to say something," Clara announced as they prepared to share their Christmas feast, her voice clear and strong, and filled with the confidence that had grown within her over the months since Ezekiel had rescued them from the auction block. "A year ago, Bess and I had nothing. No home, no family, no hope for anything better than the cruelty we had always known. Tonight, we have everything that matters. A home built with our own hands, a family chosen by love rather than blood, and friends who were willing to risk everything to defend what we've built together." She looked at Ezekiel, whose scarred face reflected the firelight with the serene expression of a man who had found peace after years of searching. "You saved our lives," she said simply. "But more than that, you taught us that we were worth saving. You showed us that dignity wasn't something that could be bought or sold, but something that lived in the human heart and could never be taken away as long as we refused to surrender it." Bess nodded, her green eyes bright with tears of gratitude and joy. "The Bible says that God works all things together for good for those who love Him," she said softly. "I used to wonder how anything good could come from the terrible things that happened to us. Now I understand that God used even our darkest moments to bring us to this place, to this family, to this joy that is more precious because we know what it means to live without it." As they joined hands around their table and Bess led them in a prayer of thanksgiving that seemed to encompass not just their own blessings but the hopes and dreams of everyone who had stood with them in their struggle, the sound of their voices rose toward the rafters and beyond, carrying gratitude and joy into the mountain night. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their valley in the pristine white of new beginnings. The garden slept beneath its winter covering, but come spring it would bloom again with renewed vigor. The stream sang its eternal song beneath the ice, waiting for the warmth that would free it to dance once more in the sunlight. And in the cabin that had become the heart of their small world, three people who had found each other against impossible odds settled in for a winter of contentment and hope. The spring that followed brought visitors from across the territory and beyond, people who had heard the story of the mountain family that had stood against corporate power and emerged victorious. Newspaper reporters came to write articles about their struggle, while ministers used their example in sermons about standing firm in the face of adversity. Government officials arrived to study their community as a model for honest development of frontier land, and even tourists began to make the difficult journey up the mountain trails to see the valley that had become famous throughout the West. Through it all, Clara, Bess, and Ezekiel maintained the simple dignity and genuine warmth that had first brought them together. They welcomed visitors with the hospitality that was their natural way, shared their story without bitterness or boasting, and continued to build their life together with the patient devotion that had sustained them through their darkest hours. Clara's bread became legendary throughout the territory, and travelers would go miles out of their way to taste the loaves that seemed to carry within them the essence of home itself. Bess's voice continued to lift hymns toward the heavens, but now it was joined by the voices of children from neighboring families who came to their valley for Sunday services and stayed for lessons in reading and music. Ezekiel, no longer the solitary mountain man who had lived for 8 years with only horses and ravens for company, found himself the unofficial patriarch of a growing community that looked to him for guidance and wisdom. His cabin had become too small for his expanded family, and with the help of neighbors and friends, he built a larger home that could accommodate not only his household, but the stream of visitors who sought the peace and hospitality of their mountain sanctuary. As summer settled over their valley, with its abundance of wildflowers and gentle breezes, as the garden flourished under Clara's careful tending, and the stream sparkled with the laughter of children who had come to spend their days in paradise, the three people who had found each other in darkness and built something beautiful in the light sat together on their expanded porch and watched the sun set behind the western peaks. The auction block in Copper Ridge seemed like something from another lifetime, a nightmare from which they had awakened to find themselves living in a dream made real through love, determination, and the simple faith that human beings were meant for something better than the cruelty that too often passed for normal life. Their story had become legend, but more importantly, it had become life. Real, abundant life lived in community, with people who understood that the most precious things in this world were not gold or land or power, but the bonds of affection that could transform strangers into family and make even the humblest dwelling a palace fit for kings. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above their mountain sanctuary, Bess began to sing Amazing Grace, her voice pure and clear as mountain water. Clara joined her, and then Ezekiel, and finally the sound reached beyond their porch to touch the hearts of everyone within hearing, carrying with it the message that grace could indeed be found in the most unlikely places, and that love once kindled could light up the darkest corners of the world with hope that would never be extinguished.